Yeah,
You know,
and I mean,
so you were working very closely with her, having played that part so much.
absolutely, and so important. We had, one of the interesting things about this film is we had 9 weeks rehearsal, and that rehearsal process, a lot of that was going back to the book and seeing what, particularly actually for my character, when I got the part, Tom and I had long discussions about the fact that, on stage, he's almost an operatic, romantic sort of type, but that on film that wouldn't be permissible, and to have an audience see where he's coming from, we needed to weave in some of the detail from the book, of which there is a massive amount. And what was wonderful about having Sam there was having someone who, as we moved away in some ways from the stage piece, when things weren't working, we thought, wait, no, how did it work in Trevor Nunn's production, and how did we? And so there was a constant sort of dialogue, and it felt, the most staggering thing for me was this two worlds meeting of theatre and film. And whilst in so many ways they should be worlds that are very close, I always can't get over how far apart they are, and they are totally different beasts. And in some ways it was the Annies and Hughes who've worked in both of those worlds that kind of could find that point of intersection.
Well, it's just exciting when somebody tries something new, and I think one of the things you're talking about with the fear is that none of you really knew when you were looking at it for the first time if it was going to work.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it does work, but the big question is going to be how far and wide does it work?
Yeah.
I think it works for anyone who loves Les Mis.
Yeah,
that's
interesting.
For sure.
Yeah.
That part you got.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one of Tom's problems when working on the script was, do you make this half-spoken and half-sung as normal film movie musicals are? Or is there a shift each time you go into the singing? Is that something that isolates an audience? What contract do you make with the audience? And I wouldn't say there was one answer to that. I mean, for example, one of the things, again, in that song, Empty Chairs Next to Tables, something I did in the audition was start the song unaccompanied. Because I felt like the second this guy is talking about survivor guilt, and the second you have a sort of this very famous introduction, an audience is sat there going, oh right, he's about to sing. Do you know what I mean?
Good
you
question.
Can see him going like, he's about to breathe. And so actually the idea of making the thought spontaneous and coming from a place of sort of, extraordinary anguish is complicated, because you can tell that he's already taking a breath to present this thing rather than to... And so things like finding ways into songs that were... internalised is a word that we've sort of used quite a lot, but that meant that you weren't shoving something in an audience. Exactly, you weren't. There you go. Yeah, you weren't shoving it in an audience's face, but letting them come.
Talk about working with Hooper, because as you probably know, he's a man with a reputation for being rather formidable and tough and demanding.
Yeah.
And of course, he's brilliant, and he gets great results out of that. But how much were you helped by him, and how much were you challenged and pushed by him?
Yeah, well, I worked with Tom before about
Elizabeth.
On Elizabeth, the HBO piece, about 7 years ago, and it was one of my first jobs, and it's very interesting because there's almost a sort of he's I think to be a great director you have to be a polymath, and certainly on this film, as far as the musical capability and sensitivities, on top of all the visual, artistic, and then sort of, as it were, political aspects of filmmaking. He needed to also have this whole sort of musical aspect, and yet Tom managed seemingly to find a simplicity through it, which is for me about storytelling. And I remember in the process of the rehearsal on this, working through the script with him and pulling aspects from the book, and yet he is always very, very strong in his sense of what the take on it will be, and yet whilst doing so, you feel as an actor very comforted by that. You feel like you're in a strong, you're working with someone who has a strong voice, but at the same time, he manages to be very open-spirited and let people engage with him and suggest ideas, and right up, through the process. One of the interesting things, though, is he has a rigor and a work ethic kind of unlike anything I've seen, and it is formidable, that, and it makes everyone step up. And I think that with someone like Hugh Jackman and Annie Hathaway, he met people, like-minded people, who were incredibly passionate and will push things to every extreme. But he will do things like, I remember an example was Hugh and I were shooting in the swamp, the sewer scenes. We're in this, hideous cold water, mud, and we were in there for 2 days for sort of 12 hours a pop. And there's a moment when I'm meant to be sort of dead and virtually dead and having sort of something stolen off me by Sacha Baron Cohen, and we get into the sort of. He gets into the close-up, and Tom's like, right, Ed, we're going to need you need to be still here for this, because you're meant to look dead. And I was like, Tommy, I've lost, the feeling in my limbs. But what's interesting is Hugh is just such a sort of, a hero in these things. He sort of feels no pain. He goes, well, so I felt completely pathetic as everyone was sort of working through the pain barriers. But he does work you hard, but from a passionate place, and from one of the work. And
so it feels like he's a strong leader who's giving you
yeah.
the containment that makes you feel safe.
Particularly on a film of this scale. I've worked on independent films in which nothing makes me more happy as an actor than to be part of a film that has a director's voice. That you go, this is a Tom Kalin film, or this is a Derek Martini film. Whatever people's take on the subject or the thing, it's like it has. And I think what's interesting is that Tom Hooper absolutely has that, and will have that too, even on a massive studio film, in which of course there are, particularly with theatre and film, that it's a very collaborative thing, and yet you still feel like you're part of his take on the work.
So tell the story about the barricades, about how you had to do that
them
live.
Well, so Eve Stewart, the designer, with Tom, they had built this huge Parisian street in the Richard Attenborough stage at Pinewood, and it was intricate and beautiful, and there were these shops with ironmongery and really specific. You could really delve into the back of these shops, and it got to this day when we were building the barricades, and Tom had 50 peasants and then maybe 30 students there, and he got 5 cameras and dressed them up as the cameramen dressed up as peasants, and the cameras covered in tarpaulin. And he put 10 minutes worth of stock in the film, so we as actors couldn't see anything other than the occasional glint of lens. And he said, right, build a barricade, action. And I just remember all of us sitting there going, what do you mean? And then suddenly these pianos and wardrobes of these things falling overhead, and we just had to ransack this beautifully designed stage. We had to go to pulling everything and anything, and we were being sort of encouraged to. It was incredibly anarchic.
Sounds like fun.
It was so much fun, but Tom was so brilliant in that sense, because we couldn't see where the cameras were. But the point of that rebellion and those moments is this mixture of political passion and agenda, but also when you've been, as kids, believing in something, but they're not born fighters, they're not trained, so, they don't really know what they're doing. And so within that scenario comes an adrenaline that is very specific, and of course as a group of actors we had that in our faces, and so there were scenarios like that. Or I know that.
Now, did he end up using the exact thing, or they must have played with it a little?
No, well, we couldn't with that. We couldn't. As in, did they use the barricade?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to my absolute shock, they did. So the answer is you can build a barricade in 10 minutes first, but second, if you put your mind to it, we all sort of had.
So you had to climb over it.
Yeah. Well, the next day
was it safe?
we came to work assuming they'd have brought in the sort of set designed version, but no, they'd pinned together, but literally with nails. So the thing was, but it was a booby trap. And but again, Tom, it was interesting hearing him talk about it at Q&A the other day, because I was like constantly going, is this thing going to fall apart? Like what? But again, throughout the rest of the 2 months we were shooting on the barricade, or month on the barricade,